Hi, this is Tanya Becker, and I'm your host for today's episode of PartsVu Xchange Talks Boating. If you haven't already, please subscribe to PartsVu Xchange Talks Boating wherever you get your podcasts. Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any content there either. Ashley Deming, the Director of Education and Administration for the Michigan Maritime Museum, is here with me today. The Michigan Maritime Museum is located in South Haven, Michigan, and is one of the Great Lakes' best destinations to experience freshwater maritime history, allowing visitors to explore exhibits both on and off the water. For people who may not be super familiar with the region, South Haven is on the coast of Lake Michigan in southwest Michigan. It's 122 miles scooting east around the lake from Chicago, 57 miles southwest of Grand Rapids, and 22 miles straight south of Saugatuck. I'm so glad you decided to join me today, Ashley.
Thank you for having me.
Good. It'll be a fun conversation. And full disclosure, and our regular listeners know this, I'm a proud Great Lakes girl. I grew up in the Midwest all my life, originally from Southern Ohio, and I've lived in Chicago for decades now. And it's really been living in Chicago that's deepened my awareness and true appreciation, really, of the Great Lakes. I guess it really is an understatement. I guess really understanding in a lot of ways the Great Lakes are life. You know, our drinking water in Chicago and a lot of places in the region come from the lakes. So we have a really vested interest in respecting and caring for not only Lake Michigan, but all the Great Lakes.
Well, not to mention our economy, either.
True.
Anybody on the lakes can attest to that water is truly life in many ways.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the good point about the economy. I mean, between fishing, tourism, many things, right?
Boating, right?
Boating. Yeah. We have kind of a vested interest in the boating world here at PartsVu. Our oceans rightfully get a lot of attention, but the Great Lakes, presently and certainly historically are fascinating, and I contend they don't get the credit they deserve. So I wanted to change that a little bit today.
Oh, great. Happy to help.
Good. So could you first tell our listeners a little bit about the Michigan Maritime Museum, your mission, and experiences the museum offers?
Sure. Well, the Michigan Maritime Museum is located in South Haven, Michigan, so on the coast of Lake Michigan. But really, we are about all of the Great Lakes and waterways. As you just said, water really is life, and there is a lot of history in the area. Yes, you do hear about oceans, but when you think about these lakes and people that haven't been here before, they come here and they're really inland seas. Mm-hmm. And things develop around those bodies of water along the coast and internally, because you have the smaller waterways, the rivers that are going internally. So trade happens that way. We didn't always have road systems like we do now. So the waterways were the roads. And so we see a lot of those things develop, technology develop as people move around into an area. There's a lot more that they can access with the water than they could by getting by land. So there's an incredible amount of history going back to some of the first humans that were here. At the Michigan Maritime Museum, we have a variety of different exhibits, changing and permanent. We've got Coast Guard and life-saving service exhibits. We have small craft and antique outboard motors, commercial fishing. Our Padnos, our boat shed, is a working boat shed. We have an entire on-water fleet as well of vessels from the replica and historic vessels from a variety of time periods. We do a lot of the routine maintenance and repair work in our working boat shed. Our tall ship, that's a replica from an 1810 Great Lakes sloop, is something that we sail traditionally, so we perpetuate that traditional sailing techniques and a maritime lifestyle in that way. And then our brand new Maritime Heritage Center that we just opened, it does have a very large exhibit in it right now that is full steam ahead, the golden age of passenger Great Lakes steamships. So we've got a lot of things and exhibits that we can change and focus because, as you know, the Great Lakes history is substantial. There's no way you can do it all at once, all in the same place. So with the new facility that we just opened, we're very excited to be able to change those kinds of exhibits out and be able to feature a lot more than we could previously.
That's great. I want to spend, a big chunk of our time talking about the new exhibit, the Golden Age of Passenger Steamships. But you did raise when we were when we were preparing, for our conversation today. You pointed out that I believe it's today, right? The anniversary of the sinking of the Edmund Fritz is today.
Yes.
So, there were hundreds of shipwrecks in Lake Michigan and the Great Lakes as a whole. Thousands. Okay. Stand corrected. What was the significance of the Edmund Fritz tragedy?
Well, I think some of the significance of the Edmund Fitzgerald really is because of how widely spread the information was about it. It's still in living memory, which makes a big deal. And then it became truly famous when Gordon Lightfoot made the song, about it. So it is significant. There was, everyone passed away. So there was 29 lives that were lost. There were other vessels in that storm, but it was a very large freighter. And it just kind of disappeared and was lost then for quite some time until rediscovered the location in Lake Superior. So I think everyone enjoys a good tragedy story, but because it's still in living memory, it was probably one of the massive tragedies that happen in living memory for many people. And so I think in some ways that's what makes it significant. Historically, I wouldn't want to say it's so significant that it stands out in many of the other tragedies that we had, but those kinds of large storm events end up being points in history that you look at. In 1913, there was a great storm of 1913 that took a lot of freighters, a lot of boats, and there's many stories of that same thing where it was all loss of life there as well. So we have these things in history that kind of come about and then are maybe made more famous by the press that they get. We've all heard of the Titanic, but just around the same time, the Eastland rolled over in Chicago, and there were more passenger lives lost on the Eastland than on the Titanic. But we don't hear about that in the same way. It was incredibly tragic, but the Titanic got a lot more press than the Eastland for longer. Maybe it's a more exciting story in some ways because of the opulence of that particular vessel. So when you talk about the significance of some of these events, I don't really find any more one significant necessarily than the other. It just ends up being what press did they get, and then they're known more for other people. But certainly an interesting shipwreck in the time period of living memory. And that is remembered now. We still have descendants, from the vessel, people that were involved with that vessel, and they are able to memorialize that and remember that in a variety of ways. The Shipwreck Museum in Whitefish Point features a lot of artifacts from that vessel, but also they have a ceremony. The Mariners Church in Detroit also has a ceremony for that, and often they live stream those things. So that's something that I know will be after the events here, as they're probably happening today. But next year, that's something that they do annually that someone could kind of tune into if they're interested in that.
What year did the Edmund Fitzgerald sink?
1975.
1975. Okay, good. Well, not good, but that makes sense. I mean, many people are still going to be alive that were, your point, associated with it.
Certainly in Michigan. I mean, I think if you really asked outside of, Michigan, the only reference people would have is probably the Gordon Lightfoot song. But it still, it made every newspaper, it made everything. It just kind of disappeared. The Arthur Anderson went out to look for it, another freighter went back out into the storm, and just radio contact just stopped. So it was really one of those mysteries, those tragedies that I think make it still prevalent in people's minds just because of that kind of event.
That's interesting. So let's talk about your new exhibit. I think that most people know that the Great Lakes were, and really still are, from a commercial perspective, quite important. But it wasn't really, I didn't really realize the luxury passenger vessels in that sort of scene that sailed the Great Lakes. Can you give us a little bit of overview of these ships and, when they were in their prime and a bit about them?
Sure. we have some pretty incredible histories of passenger steamships, on the Great Lakes. With the Industrial Revolution and the development of steam, that meant that we could have larger ships, more powerful vessels, and they could get there faster. They could carry more things, including freight and people, which they did do both. It was a business. So we have a lot of these vessels that are traveling around, taking people from place to place. We have night routes, we have day routes, we have weekly, routes, and that's really how people were getting around. Remember, there weren't a lot of really developed roads, even railways. People are moving by water. So to be able to add that sort of experience and then make it a fun kind of vacation-like opulent experience, I think really helped that business. So there were really sort of two periods of the steam development where it was very popular. So we had an initial period right when steam kind of took over for boats. And then the golden age, really, which we're focusing on, is really that very late 1800s into the 1900s, 1920s, 1930s. And really, it sort of ended about World War I, ish, but there were still vessels that continued to do that luxury passenger experience well beyond that. The Milwaukee Clipper, which is in Muskegon, that continued into the 70s. But again, we have fewer and fewer vessels that were doing that. The Boblo Island amusement park boats were ferrying people to Boblo Island in that opulent kind of way, even into the 90s, I believe. Oh, wow. So there were still things out there, but as it got more expensive to continue with these vessels with steam power, and then again with the increase in better roadways, of cars, of access, it was a lot cheaper for people to do that. They had more control over their schedules with vehicles, that kind of thing. We really see the decline of those kinds of vessels and experiences. But these boats were called floating palaces of the Great Lakes. So they did not spare any expense. Really, if you think about the Titanic and kind of the opulence of that really was sort of recreated, but in a smaller scale for these Great Lakes passenger steamships.
So would people use them more, to cruise, like to literally sail around for extended periods of time, or, more as transportation to get to a resort, or both?
Both, really.
Yeah. Okay.
You're not looking at like the ocean-going liners that might take you a significant amount of time to cross that body of water. We're really not looking at anything more than about a week-long excursion. Okay. A lot of people were doing day tripping between here and Chicago. Was very popular, so that kind of thing. Or they would cross the lake maybe overnight and end up to Milwaukee, something like that. So people are using these boats in a variety of different ways. The size of those boats might be a little bit smaller if they're just the day trippers as opposed to something for a week. Remember, these are businesses, so they're going to have the equipment to make sure that they're making money and able to give that experience to everyone. But it didn't really matter if they were doing the overnight boats or the week-long boats. The vessels themselves were still incredibly spectacular. It was really all about that luxurious feel as a passenger when you got on that vessel. Wow. And it wasn't just for the super wealthy either. There were, regular folks that were, getting on that boat, maybe coming to a resort or something like that here. So in South Haven, for example, they might come over on the City of South Haven vessel from Chicago or the Eastland, and they would then stop here and get off the boat, and then maybe their resort was farther upriver, and they would get on a small little river launch, something like what we have at the museum. Lindy Lou is our river cruiser, so they would offload luggage and people onto those smaller boats and then take them upriver to their resorts. It was maybe a nicer, more luxurious kind of water taxi to taxi them to the places they were headed. So that experience, almost from start to finish, was quite a popular one for people to do. And where these large vessels are going to, they're much larger cities and places. So those vessels aren't going to remote locations. It needs to be where there's going to be a lot of people, where they're going to be able to drop it off. And really, I'm sure many of your viewers, listeners have been on a cruise ship before. This is just that on a much smaller scale.
Yeah, right.
So it's that business model is very much the same. And in fact, we're seeing a whole revitalization of that Great Lakes cruising with Viking right now on the Great Lakes. So
I've heard
you can
about
experience some of that opulence, not quite in the same way.
Yeah.
I don't think they quite build them like they used to in that respect, but still that luxurious kind of passenger experience for a week or 2 weeks that you might be on the Great Lakes even right now.
I just recently heard about the Viking cruises. That is so interesting. And, I'm really interested in doing that actually.
So I know in kind of prepping for this, you were asking me some numbers. So I was able to kind of pull some numbers for us here as we talk about who was really traveling on the Great Lakes and in these steamships. So we're looking at really the 1920s, and we're talking about maybe a round trip for a family of 4. So an overnight trip from Cleveland to Buffalo, for example, for a family of 4 would have been $31 in the 20s.
That's a lot of money.
In today's money for a family of 4, that would be roughly $530.
Well, manageable, right?
Now, an overnight trip right now from Ludington to Manitowoc, Wisconsin, is $550. So it's pretty comparable in that regard. A day excursion, something like Mackinac City to Mackinac Island, kind of a ferrying sort of scenario, in the 1920s would have been $3.60. Again, that's round trip for 4 people. Today, that'd be about $61 for that. But with inflation, that same trip today, if you were to do it for a family of 4, would be nearly $100 for that.
Wow. Interesting.
So again, when you're looking at the affordability of those kinds of things, I think a lot of your average, income folks, families are probably doing more of the day trips. A 10-day cruise in the 20s from Buffalo to Duluth was $268 for that family of 4, which is about $4,500 today. So you see, you're kind of moving a little bit. I still think, probably affordable for people on a vacation. That's something special. But again, getting up there. If we look at a Viking cruise today from Milwaukee to Thunder Bay, Ontario, for example, that same time period, 8-day cruise, it is $13,400.
Whoa.
So it's a little bit, you're now seeing maybe a little bit different when you're dealing with vacation. Again, that's for 4 people. That's not a per person kind of a thing. But still, that kind of gives you a little bit more of a flavor for what we're looking at and what people might be able to do. So a daily excursion, versus the overnights and the weekly or that kind of thing are going to be, those are obviously, you're spending more time, you're eating the food, you're, doing more of that kind of thing on the boat. It's going to cost a little bit more to have that luxurious experience, just as it would today. There's some things that really never change.
Right, exactly. So did these historic ships, we know that you mentioned that they were shipping freight as well as people. Were there different classes for passengers, like a first class? No, it was all the same.
Everybody is together on these vessels. They're not the same sizes as some of those ocean going liners where you're really separating, that kind of thing out. So I'm sure there are experiences aboard those vessels that maybe you ended up paying a little bit more for, but most everything was pretty open. You probably could buy just a seat on the boat and not a stateroom, for example, that sort of thing. So there may be some cost differences and how your experience was. And that's similar for a train car, too, right? If you're going to have a sleeper versus, staying up all night in a club car kind of a thing. So we're seeing the same business model pretty much across most of that transportation. But in these, you're in the same spaces. All the public spaces are the same. You don't have a separate dining room for different classes. And that opulence was amazing. I mean, again, it's phenomenal to be able to see some of the interiors of these vessels. And it's no wonder that at some point it kind of was not economically viable, anymore with how they were being built. And again, these are wooden boats. Many of them are wooden. We moved to obviously metal, or at least clad a little bit later in times for some of them, but it's a lot of upkeep. And I know here at the Michigan Maritime Museum, we deal with a lot of wooden boats, so we know firsthand, maybe not that size, but still, anybody that deals with wooden boats can tell you that there's a lot of maintenance and upkeep for those to make sure that they're safe and reliable, especially when you're taking people out on them.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so interesting. I'm really looking forward to seeing the exhibit. And I'm more interested than ever in saving up for the Viking cruise.
Well, hopefully you get maybe a little bit flavor of what that was like. The exhibit, the way that we've really set it up on a much smaller scale, but it really trying to put you in the shoes of a passenger that is boarding the boat and seeing these different spaces. Learning a little bit about what that was, like for them, but having you really feel like you're stepping back in time as a passenger, and you're walking the dock, boarding the boat, meeting the purser, those kinds of things as you kind of go through, and then you'll see some of the technology that was available on those boats in that kind of time period as well. So it's a really wonderful exhibit. There's tons of hands-on things for kids of all ages to do and to touch and to really interact with. And that was something that we really wanted to make sure we did with this exhibit, is make sure it's very family friendly. For those people that really like to get into history, yes, there is, reading panels and information panels in places, but we also have a number of digital interactives that go a lot deeper. So if you want to learn a little bit more, you truly could spend a large portion of your day in just that exhibit before you even headed out to the rest of the campus that we have here at the Michigan Maritime Museum.
That's awesome. Well, thanks so much for being here, Ashley. It was such an interesting conversation. And I encourage everyone to check out the Michigan Maritime Museum. I mean, the museum's website address is www, of course, michiganmaritimemuseum.org. And I've included the link in the show notes so people can easily access and check it out. And people can also follow you on Instagram at Michigan Maritime Museum, and on Facebook as well. I've linked those pages in the show notes as well. So thanks again. It was great. It was great having you.
Thank you. Really appreciate being here today.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the PartsVu Xchange Talks Boating podcast. Are you in a dock war with your boating neighbor for the cleanest boat? Check out our marine soaps, polishes, waxes, and more at PartsVu.com. And for free shipping, use the coupon code PVTalksShine, a special perk for our podcast listeners. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram for boating knowledge, to keep in touch with the PartsVu community, and for special sales and promotions. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast, and check out the show notes for the coupon code just mentioned, more information about PartsVu and the products we offer, as well as our boating blog, the PartsVu Xchange. And a big thanks to Mind for performing the original music featured within this podcast.